The LTO Show, the premier podcast for leaders in the LTO tape storage community. Each episode dives deep into the business and technology issues that matter most. The LTO Show keeps you informed and inspired. Be part of the future of storage today.
Welcome back to the LTO Show and the second part of part one of our end user series entitled It's Not All Backup. Today we pick up again with Carl Watts, storage architect and IT specialist with the Library of Congress, as he covers his principles for backup and data archive that include fresh perspectives on long-term content preservation. Is immutable storage the magic bullet for compliance? Vendors keep shouting immutable. If I buy that, do I get to ignore the rest?
Immutable storage, in other words, warm policies and object locks that come with the storage device, is necessary but not sufficient. You need to have the right retention rules, know who or what place that data into legal hold. You need auditability of that storage, and that auditability needs to be, who's accessed it every time it's been accessed. You also need to be able to set the right retention periods. So if you've got a 7-year retention closes, it needs to be able to start that delete immediately after you hit that retention. But if you're on a legal hold, it needs to be able to handle, we're freezing it and it won't delete that data because we're in a legal hold situation.
So how do legal holds interact with retention schedules? If legal says do not delete, does that override everything forever?
It overrides it for the period of time that the legal hold is there. So you'll need to be able to pause in your retention periods for that, whatever is currently on legal hold, and ensure that that data isn't destroyed while that legal hold is in process. Once that legal hold is done, then you can remove that retention policy of it being that retention policy and put it back to normal retention, and then get it wiped or moved or deleted at that point. But the last thing you want to happen is have data that's on hold and then have it all of a sudden vanish, even though technically in most cases, it hasn't vanished because it's more than likely still on a tape somewhere, which means that you'll have to play dumpster dive to find the data that you deleted out of your database.
So where do email, chat, and collaboration tools fit? We got email, Teams, Slack, whatever. Are those backup, statutory, or long-term preservation?
Unfortunately, they're all three, depending on your organization. So again, we could backup. Backup is email gets backed up. Email boxes get backed up on a daily or weekly basis. Depending upon what email is being handled, it also hits statutory, as well as your Slack and your Teams messages also might be part of your statutory, because conversations between peers or between individuals might be something that has to be held on to for a longer period of time. And then in some cases, like email, it might be something that gets curated over time, and you're holding the physical email as an actual object. It may not be a PST file, but it might be a document version or a text version of that email, and it's being stored off to the side and been curated to tell the history of what happened within the organization. So those areas are kind of tricky, and you need to have a conversation internally to figure out how you want to handle each one of those flavors of communications.
So how does right to be forgotten play with legal holds and archives? So if someone invokes data protection rights, like delete my data, can we just shrug and point? Do we just call it a legal hold? How does that work?
So you need a balance and a documented approach. So you need to, again, think this through before it turns into a problem. So if the data is under a legal or regulatory hold, it has to be held on to. It can't be deleted. You can't remove the person or the person for the right to be forgotten for that period of time that legal hold is going on. After that legal hold is done, or before any legal hold is done, then that right to be forgotten, you would have to go through and get tools to anonymize your data. So basically you end up with a system having amnesia about who that person is that's requested that. And in the archival space, you'll need to be aware of the personal data, where the personal data lives. But you have to also look at how you're handling your continuity. So if you do start having to play with the data, you might need to look at version control of that data so that you build a new version and place the other version off to the side and have a private side versus a compliance side.
So how often should we test our backups, legal retrievals, and archival reads? We backed it up once in 2019. That's good, right?
Well, one would hope that if there's a backup in 2019 that we've already removed it, but you need to do monthly restores.
Mm-hmm.
You need to go through and pick some data from some date and then restore it to a temporary location just to be able to figure it out. Or in the case, let's say a VM, be able to recreate the whole VM as a pseudo VM to be able to say, okay, yep, we can restore the whole machine if we needed to. For statutory, you need to be able to go do a research, retrieve, and export the data. You might want to be doing that monthly or quarterly, but that's something needs to be worked out internally and needs to be well documented. And lastly, on your long-term preservation storage space, hopefully you've been storing fixies with that data, whether that's fixies are being stored internal with your software product or being stored in your curatorial database, or somehow you've stored that. And then you'd be able to spot check files every once in a while, depending upon how big your preservation space is. If you're talking, a few petabytes, you might be able to get through that, through the whole system in 1 year, where if you're talking tens of petabytes, you'll want to do a percentage of that every year just to do verification.
Mm-hmm.
Also, as you do your preservation migrations going from between platforms, whether that's a 7 or 10 year horizon, you'll want to do verifications because you have at that point of every object or every file that you're moving. So it gets kind of tricky on how often, but you also need to write policies down for each one of those.
Right. So what metrics should I track for each of those three areas? What do I put in the executive dashboard for backup, statutory, and long-term preservation?
So in backup, you're looking at, you have to put down what your restore rate is and what your successful restore rate is as well. You need to test your RPO and RTO versus what you had targeted and make sure that it's realistic. If they're not realistic, you need to go back and reevaluate and figure out how can you meet your RPO or RTO requirements. It might be that you have to get a different product or more equipment. And then, of course, you have to do, in the case of backups, that ever inevitable ransomware drill because somebody clicked on the wrong thing and started and locked up the whole environment with ransomware. So you want to be able to validate that you can bring back the pieces or parts. Hopefully they've unplugged it quick enough, but your backups should be able to bring back and restore your data. On the statutory preservation side, you need to look at the number of systems that are under this policy, how much data is under that policy, and the percentage of enforced retention that you have for all that data, and the timing for all that data. So looking at how long do I have to hold on to it, and how much data am I accumulating on a monthly or yearly basis, and ensure that you're building your systems accordingly, and then finding a way to audit all this. So auditing where the data originated, in how you're auditing the statutory, where it's being held statutorily, because you need to be able to prove that no one's tampered with that. On your long-term preservation, you have to look at your collections. Now, how many collections you have, how frequently are they being used? Some data might be getting used more than others. There's we go through this term active archive, where you're always going through a certain level of churn of that data. You have to look at how many migrations or how many files you're going to have to files in amount of terabytes or petabytes that you need to migrate from one system to the next. And then you have to look at what your geographic dispersal is. That is, which will, we talk about a 3-2-1 environment. In preservation space, you need to have 3 copies of the data, 2 different medium types, and with one being geodispersed. If you can't measure it, you can't explain it to the regulators, and thus you can't be trusted. So you need to be able to show that you're a trusted organization.
So if I move to the cloud, does that magically solve any of this or make it easier? Do a lot of these issues, management issues, become the cloud provider's problem at all?
The quick answer is no. It's always going to be your problem. So the cloud changes where the data lives, but it's not changing your requirements. So the regulators are still want to know, or your legal department's going to want to know the history of how that data was used. So when you're designing the systems, you need to look at, your backup recovery strategy. Yeah, you can go to it as a service, but you still are in charge of maintaining the policies. That's not a magic bullet there. Statutory, you still need to prove the immutability of what's being retained, because if it gets changed or altered, well, that's on you. And then, of course, then you have your preservation, which is, you start paying for export fees, the migration cost, and redundancy plan for storing this data into the cloud. So storing the data is not a compliance or preservation strategy. It's just a location strategy.
So is there one platform that can do all of these jobs? Is there some magical product that does backup, statutory, and long-term preservation, so I don't need to hassle with it so much?
Yeah, no. So the quick answer is no. There's not one monolithic platform that handles everything. Every product, from what I've seen, sometimes the backup and the backup product will have a separate piece that gets hooked into it for governance, but it's still curatorial staff that needs to be involved in the long-term preservation side. So that sits off into a system all by itself. You might be able to get away with, for backup and statutory, using the same type system, but even there, usually you end up with a separate system there as well. But trying to put it all into one space, not really something that you should be looking to try to do. You could use your tape archival space or your long-term store space and be able to partition it out. But past that, software-wise, you're looking at least 2, if not 3 different software platforms.
So through all this, Carl, how do we avoid paying 3 times for the same terabyte? I mean, nobody wants to pay for storage 3 different ways.
So you can shrink your footprint in these ways. You can be using tiered storage with policies-driven placement. You can separate logical functions, again, your backup, compliance, archive, with physical storage via you can use the same storage tier or storage systems, but the software will take care of that piece for you. Deduping backups will save you some space, but you don't want it to be deduping your preservation data. Compliance data, depending upon your regulations, you may be able to dedupe that as well, as long as you're able to show that the data hasn't been altered as far as what gets output. Reuse of an underlying object or tape infrastructure will keep distinctive layers of storage and retention rules, but in the long run, you need to architect it properly, and then reuse the foundations carefully instead of just cut and pasting silos.
Let's talk about migrations because they come up a lot. New storage system, new backup, new archive. When we migrate, what breaks first?
Okay, your risk points are losing retention and hold metadata. So you need to ensure that you're holding on to that and looking at how the new system will handle your old system's information and how do you get that data moved in between systems. It sometimes will break your audit trails if you've gone to a new platform. So again, you need to look at how you maintain that for compliance purposes. You have to ensure against bit rot. So you're going to need to ensure that everything's, whether it's an internal checksum via the software platform or an external system that's holding on to your checksums or fixities for your objects, whether that object is a backup of compliance object or even your preservation data, that bit for bit gets transferred over. And your failure to re-implement immutability guarantees, it turns into a problem as well. During your migration, you must treat the backup catalog as an item. You must treat your compliance index as an item, your previous index, so from your previous systems, in your archival metadata, because those are all your first-class citizens, and it shows what work has been done with the data that's being moved around.
Carl, when should we intentionally delete data? Everyone talks about saving, but when do we deliberately say, I'm getting rid of it?
You should delete it when the retention period ends. Most people, I deal with a lot of people with disposophobia, but in the case of backups and regulatory, you want to get rid of it when via the policies driven. And if there's a legal hold that's holding something for a period of time, you fulfill the legal hold. But if the data retention is past that legal hold period, as soon as that legal hold comes off, ensure that the data gets deleted, because after the legal hold is gone, you don't want to have to go back to it again. If there's no legal or business reason to hold on to the data, get rid of it. If it's not part of your historic value, get rid of it. If it's a person left the company and it's their personal space that their home directory, and if it's not part of a legal purpose for it to be held on to, get rid of it. Granted, that's on the storage system first, but if some server has been gotten rid of, and unless there's a regulatory reason to hold on to that server or VM, again, data to be gotten rid of. So good governance is we never delete anything. Sounds safe, but often is a dangerous option.
So this is interesting to me today. Where does AI search and summarization fit into all this? So if we slap AI into the equation, do we still care about how we store things, or does that change how we store things?
Yeah, it works best when your content is organized, well described, and deduplicated, because you don't want multiple entries for that data. You can clearly have clear access controls and provide provenance on that data. And as long as your archive is structured, but it doesn't play well with backups at all. So it's more of something in your preservation. It helps in the preservations or the statutory preservation space and in your long-term space, but it doesn't play well with backups. AI only really makes sense for preservation value, and it doesn't fix any bad storage hygiene, however.
So what's the worst case scenario if we ignore statutory preservation? So if we don't follow some of the policies we talked about today, what can happen?
Get ready for some fines. If you're not holding your data correctly, they're going to come at you, and they're going to come at you hard. Personal liability, at least for the officers involved, could even fall down to the management, for anywhere from management to the C-suites. They're not going to be happy if they're getting dragged in.
Yeah,
it's just cheaper to design in it on purpose than retrofit in a subpoena. So get it done, do it right the first time, and maintain it.
What's the worst case scenario if we ignore long-term preservation? And if we ignore it, what happens besides some historians being annoyed because we didn't hold it for them?
You can lose proof of strategic decisions. So let's say you got a patent out there. You want to be able to prove that when your idea started to when you've actually submitted your paperwork. If you don't have that data, it's not going to work out for you. Production research history. You don't want to end up having to basically restart or do everything over again because you've lost your paperwork and you didn't know, or person X doesn't know what person Y has already accomplished. You end up losing a lot of institutional knowledge if you're not preserving your historic data. So the differences between being a company that exists and a company that's left in the trace worth learning from. So you basically, you want to hold on to and manage that data appropriately.
So, Carl, as an executive, if I'm listening to this, what are my first reactions if some of this sounds fuzzy? So I hear this and I kind of go, I know we've kind of been winging this in my organization. What are the first 3 grown-up moves I can make to make it better?
So the first thing you need to do is you need to demand a simple map of how everything is laid out. What's in backup, what's in compliance, and how are you handling it today, and who owns each one of those, and what systems in your environment are managing these. Then you need to assign clear accountability. You need one leader in charge of backup. You need another one for statutory. You need another one for your long-term preservation archive space. And lastly, you need to set a realistic targets for your RPO and RTOs, for your legal, and for how long you plan to maintain your preservation, and provide the proper funding levels for those. And you need to revisit that annually. Annually is probably good. Just don't consider it an afterthought and don't lose track of it.
Right. And I'm thinking then that I need to structure some governance around these 3 action items. So do I need 3 committees, or how should I set that up?
Governance should be set up as a single group. That group should include somebody from your IT and infrastructure, your security, legal, records management team, and any business units that are involved. So, and then build a charter for that. So no, it doesn't have to be one per item, but it needs to be governance needs to be structured properly to look at the entire organization, not just a piece of the organization.
Carl made it clear today, you need clear ownership. IT owns backup. Legal and compliance drive statutory preservation, and long-term preservation needs an oversight committee to ensure your organization's important IP is properly managed for the future. The governance piece is critical. You can't just back up everything forever and call it preservation. That's how you get unsearchable junk, non-compliant retention, and sometimes angry regulators. You need curated, documented, managed storage with rich metadata, format migration plans, and fixity checks. And here's the kicker. LTO tape plays a starring role in all 3 functions, especially statutory preservation with worm capabilities and long-term preservation where durability and cost-effectiveness matter more than sub-hour recovery times. So I want to thank Carl Watts again for bringing such clarity to a topic that is often treated as just storage. This is strategic thinking that every CIO, general counsel, and records manager will want to hear. Thanks for joining us on the LTO Show. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Pete Paisley, and remember, it's not all backup, and understanding the difference could save your organization millions while protecting what truly matters.
You've been watching the LTO Show. Thanks for joining us. The LTO Show is produced and written by Pete Paisley. Thanks to our sponsors, these guys and these other guys. Don't miss our next episode coming soon. We feature industry leaders in data archiving that supports LTO storage.